would march down 6th Street and he would barge into these bars and he'd shame people.
That is wild.
And there was one occasion which he marched into a bar, started shaming everyone, and the bar owner said, "Hey, I bought 2 pews at St. Bavo, and you're in here yelling at me." Father Stewart took money out of his pocket, paid him back for the pews, and said, "I don't want that money.
Right.
I don't want that money in St. Bavo." So, but not only was he going around and screaming and yelling at the individuals, but he went to the law. So he would
formally.
He would go to the police.
Yes.
He would testify in court cases against all of the drinking that was going on, and he used the South Bend Tribune as a mouthpiece.
You heard that there. That's Mishawaka historian Susanna Ernst talking about Father Charles Stewart, whose leadership was extremely instrumental for early Belgian immigrants in the West End neighborhood in Mishawaka. But his crusade against alcohol in the community was not appreciated by everyone. More of that later, but first, thank you for listening to another episode of Round the Bend Now and Then. My name is Matt Emery, and I'm a local history nerd. My main mission in this podcast, as well as other Round the Bend material, is to create engaging content that shares how intertwined the South Bend and Mishawaka area's past is to our present. In the podcast, I interview local leaders, business owners, and community members to help tell their stories, because their stories help tell the story of South Bend and Mishawaka. In this episode, I meet with Mishawaka historian Susanna Ernst, and we talk about one of the area's most iconic neighborhoods, Mishawaka's Belgian West End. If you've ever driven or walked through the area, you'd quickly realize the uniqueness of it all, with multiple storefronts, houses, social club, and the beautiful St. Bavo's Church, all mixed so closely together. The neighborhood was built by Belgian immigrants in the early 1900s, and it grew into a cultural center that was equipped with everything they needed within a few block radius. Flemish-speaking grocery stores, social clubs, banks, bakeries, and even their own Catholic church. I learned so much from Susanna and her knowledge and research about the Belgian West End. It once again reaffirms that there is so much history right under our noses. I'm confident that you'll learn a thing or two as well. I want to give a shout out to some of our sponsors of this episode. Thank you to MT Box Computers at 2921 Mishawaka Avenue, right in the heart of River Park. As you'll learn later in the episode, they'll help give you peace of mind regarding your business's computer and IT needs, as their motto is, raising the standard for support services. I want to give a shout out to our new sponsor, the Portage Township Trustee Office. Most folks might not understand and may not realize just how much they do for our community and how far-reaching their services are. As you'll hear a bit later, Jason Critchlow and his team deserve many kudos for helping everyday citizens in our community. And now, learn all about Mishawaka's West End neighborhood in our interview with Susanna Ernst. Before we dive in, first just tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from, all that good stuff.
Thank you so much for having me. So I am a 5th-generation Mishawakan.
Woo! Dang.
Yes, my family came here in the early 1850s. So my great-grandfather, my grandfather, and my father and his parents, they all lived in the shadow of St. Joe Church.
Okay.
They lived at an address 114 West 4th Street. It no longer exists.
Right there, though,
yes,
the 100 block.
It was right next to the church, basically. Unfortunately, the building was torn down in the 1970s. My father attended St. Joe Grade School, St. Joe High School out in South Bend.
Yeah.
And then he attended the University of Notre Dame, and he started teaching then in Mishawaka at Maine Junior High School, which is now which was the old Mishawaka High School. It's now the Maine Junior High Apartments. And then in the summer of 1967, he met my mother in Washington, D.C. at Rock Creek National Park, where they both worked. They came back here. They settled. They were on South Main for a while, and then they moved to 902 Alabama Street in Hooligan Heights, which is where I grew up. I attended Mishawaka High School, and then I went to IU Bloomington. And then
you're an IU. Nice.
I am.
Perfect. I'm wearing this shirt now.
I am. The rest of my family is Notre Dame, but I am
We'll
Indiana
accept
University.
that too. We'll accept Notre Dame.
And then I moved out to Colorado for about 10 years and then came back this way for a corporate job in Chicago. And I did a lot of community advocacy, and I'm a volunteer.
Yeah.
And I started what is the Northwest Chicago Historical Society. So I'm the founder, and I am the president of the organization. And so it's about reviving local history. But of course, my roots are in Mishawaka, Indiana. And that is why I'm here today to talk a little bit about not my specific past, but the past of the community I grew up in.
All right. Well, hey, Susanna, thank you once again for joining us and sharing the story behind the legendary Mishawaka neighborhood, the West End. I always knew that Mishawaka had a presence of Belgian immigrants, that they predominantly settled in this area. Belgian names are plastered on buildings, Vanderhayden, the BK Club. And I've always thought it's such a neat area. I'll drive there, park, get out, and walk the dog there. I mean, it's just so much history. I love that there's storefronts on just about every corner. There's a local watering spot everywhere, and it's just a neat area. And so you'd done a presentation at the library pretty recently, right? Or
last year.
Last year, absolutely. So you did a presentation at the library last year called From Belgium to Mishawaka, a West End Story. And you provided great historical context behind the influx of Belgian immigrants moving to Mishawaka, and specifically in the area that we know as the West End. And that's what we'll talk about today.
Fantastic.
Oh, man. I love, like I said, there's so much history right under our noses. And if you blink, you won't even appreciate it. And so thank you for compiling all this information and sharing it.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Let's first talk about the geographical area of the West End. Roughly, what streets in Mishawaka border it?
So today, the heart of the West End is at 7th and West, right where St. Bavo is located.
Okay.
And I think that people would probably agree that it goes south down to Rose Park.
Yeah.
Probably as far east then as Maine and as far west as Logan. And north it comes probably up over the tracks into maybe 4th and 3rd Street, but not as far as Lincoln Way, I would say. But maybe people might say that. And I will tell you that historically it has moved. So back right before 1900, when people talked about the West End, they were talking about anything west of Spring Street, basically.
Okay.
So you could be up by the river there. And as a matter of fact, there was an affluent club that they lived in the mansions there along Lincoln Way. And they called themselves the West End Club, and they would play cards and so forth. But this is, this is years ago.
Correct.
Over time, it moved south. It moved south more to the intersection of 4th and Smith. And then it finally, after St. Bavo was established in the first decade of the 20th century, that is when the heart really came to 7th and West.
Yeah. And that's the area where I was just talking. I love parking there and getting out and walking. What are some key landmarks people would recognize today when we speak of the West End?
Well, when we speak of the West End, of course, the beautiful edifice that is St. Bavo that sits there at 7th and West, that's the biggest landmark. People might remember also, too, the West End Bakery that has been around. Actually, it's been around since the 1920s in that current location since the 1940s. And they're right down the street just east of St. Bavo. And, of course, everybody knows the BK Club.
Absolutely.
And that's just a couple blocks south of St. Bavo. And that building has been around since 1930. The organization itself was established a couple years before that. But those are the three longest standing institutions in the neighborhood.
And, of course, I've been in wedding receptions and graduation parties and all that in the BK Club. And at the time, 25 years ago, I didn't really know all the history behind it. And it's just amazing that, institutions like that have been around for so long. Before any of those streets were platted, or before the area was known as the West End, it was marshland?
Yeah, it was a giant marsh. And this is where they found some of the bog iron deposits that eventually would lead to St. Joe Ironworks. It's part of the reason that the
Mishawaka's there.
Mishawaka exists is because of the fact that there were those iron deposits that were there. But imagine, if you will, the whole place just being like a swamp.
Yeah, that's crazy. And now it's urban. I mean, it is houses very close to each other. Cars all over. I mean, it's a neighborhood. So the majority of Belgian immigrants were from the Flemish.
In Mishawaka, there's really 3 main areas of Belgium where people were coming. Well, actually, there are 3 main areas of Belgium, which is Flanders, Brussels, and then Wallonia.
Okay.
Wallonia is the French-speaking region.
Okay.
Flanders is the Flemish-speaking region, and it's closer to Dutch. So Mishawaka had the largest Flemish population in the United States if we were looking at a city per capita.
Right.
And Flemish being the area of Flanders that is abutted to the Netherlands.
I got you. Okay. And early on, when they first came here, we'll get into the religious aspect of it. Life wasn't too easy as for some of them, because they just moved here. They didn't speak the language, and often religion or the churches were kind of their mainstay, kind of their cornerstone. But the churches in Mishawaka at that time didn't speak the language, and so this led to the Belgians working to get their own parish. Am I correct?
That's correct. And this is a big...
In short, I mean, it's a bigger story than that, obviously.
And,
but
honestly, I feel like this is... When we talk about this neighborhood and we talk about the people there, this feels to me like a headliner, because this was a really big deal. We had approximately 400 Belgians, roughly 100 families. They were living in Mishawaka. They were Roman Catholic, but there was only one Catholic church. That was St. Joe.
Okay.
St. Joe was a English-speaking church, although a lot of German people attended it. Okay. And it's what is known as a territorial church. And the Catholic Church would put churches in places where they knew they had people that wanted to go to church. And so you just go to whatever church was closest to you. So they'd set up borders or boundaries for the parish. Everybody would go to that. There'd be American customs. They'd speak in English. Sometimes there'd be a predominant ethnic group there, and they would talk to each other in that language. But really, St. Joe was... They were an English-speaking church with a lot of Germans that were attending there. And they also were natives for the most part.
Right.
So here the Belgians come. They're speaking Flemish, and they're sitting in these pews. They're very devout, but they don't understand what's going on. They don't understand the sermon. They don't understand a lot of the activities afterwards. They don't understand the cultural things that are going on. They did not feel at home. And by the way, the Germans look down on them too. This is the newest immigrant group. It's how things go. The newer immigrant group comes in, and the ones that were there before always look down on them, and they were uncomfortable. They would say things about them. They didn't feel like they
welcome. They
didn't feel like they belonged. And so the pastor, Father Erchtering, he's realizing this in the early 1900s. He's thinking, well, we got a lot of Flemish-speaking people here. We can tell they're uncomfortable. So he did organize the first Flemish Mass at St. Joseph, and that was in 1901. So they had a Mass, but clearly he thought they needed more because they were still unhappy. So then he established a Belgian mission at St. Joe Parish, and he asked the Bishop of Ghent in Belgium to please send over a priest to administer or to be with these people here in St. Joe Parish that are Belgians that are clearly not comfortable here. So they established a Belgian mission. This is 1902. He has a priest that comes over that says he's going to pastor them. His name is Father Charles Stewart. The pastor, or not pastor, but he's administering the mission, and everything is going swimmingly for a couple of months, and then Father Erchtering dies. So at this point, they're looking for a new pastor, but Father Stewart, who's administering to these Flemish people, says, I'm out of here. I'm going to go out west, which is where I really wanted to go. So he gives his big farewell sermon and all that. And so thinking that is that. Well, the Flemish people that were going to church there, they had reason to believe that they might be able to set up their own church, a Flemish church.
Yes.
Because what the Catholic Church had decided, what Rome had decided, they saw what was going on in the United States. They're putting all these churches in, but they could see these ethnic groups are coming in and not feeling comfortable there. They knew that they were losing members of the flock.
Right.
So they thought, we should allow them to have national parishes.
Yeah.
So these people in Mishawaka said, well, we just saw the Belgians in South Bend. They just established a national church. Sacred Heart Church was established in 1898. It was a Belgian national church in South Bend. Why can't we do that?
Right.
So they ran down to Fort Wayne. This is early 1903. They run down to Fort Wayne to talk to the bishop, Bishop Aldering. And within 2 days, he's back in Mishawaka. And he looks around and he says, you know what? You should have a national parish here. There's enough of you, and you are all very passionate about this. Within 1 week, they had 6 lots donated at 7th and West.
Wow.
The man who lived the adjacent house to those lots donated it for a rectory. They raised $7,000, which is, in today's money, over $250,000 in 1 week.
That is insane. That's how much of a need there was.
Yes. And I mean, that's a lot of money in today's money. And by the way, these people were not wealthy. I mean, they had nothing.
Yeah, they were first generation immigrants from another country.
Exactly. They had nothing. And that meant this much. So within 1 week, they had the land, they had the all this money.
Yeah.
And within 6 weeks, they had a wooden church school erected, and they held their first Mass. This is in May of 1903.
That is
the
nuts.
building was basically at 8th and West, so it's the back of where St. Bavo's is today. But so this is unbelievable. Within 6
that's wild.
weeks, they have land, they have a rectory, they have a building, they have a church school, they have thousands of dollars, and they're hosting their first Mass 6 weeks from talking to the bishop.
That's insane.
And it's also very important because the diocese often would fund the traditional, the territorial churches.
Right.
So a lot of times there was help there from the diocese. They were okay with national parishes, but they pretty much said, you guys,
on your own.
Yeah, you figure it out. If you can figure it out, you can have
it.
And that's what they did.
That is wild.
That is what they did. But so I just so much passion.
I couldn't imagine just moving to a new place and a new country. You don't speak the language. You're not feeling as welcome. And the only thing that truly can help you function in this is a church. I know it's kind of your
own sacred space.
Yes, exactly. And then at first to not have that, and then to have that, it's got to be such a great feeling.
At that Mass, in that wooden building, that first Mass, eyewitnesses say that people, men and women, had tears streaming down their face.
I'm sure.
As they're hearing their language, and as there's a giant Belgian flag on the back wall, and there are all these Belgian types of iconography that they were just familiar with, and it just felt like we have our home. So this was their space. This is St. Bavo. And St. Bavo was named right about that time.
Okay.
And it's the only church of that name in the United States.
Really? Gosh, because most of them, St. Patrick, St. Matthew, all these are so common. I did not know that. So just St. Bavo is the only one, and it's right there in the West End in Mishawaka.
That's right, a Belgian monk. And by the way, so also too, St. Bavo is the first and only national Catholic church in Mishawaka. Now, there's some in South Bend for sure. There was a Belgian, several Polish. Yes. But it was the only one in Mishawaka.
Really?
Yes, there were a lot of Germans that went to St. Joe, and yes, there were a lot of Italians that went to St. Monica's. But St. Bavo was built by the Flemish for the Flemish.
That's amazing. I mean, again, just that story in itself about the West End could be its own
exactly. I mean, it's
book.
Really it's the most important pivotal point that led to what the West End is today, because that's when they had their location.
That's like
and
the heartbeat of it.
Yes, that is the sacred heart of their community.
And now a word from one of our sponsors. I want to talk a minute about the government of Portage Township right here in South Bend. Portage Township trustee Jason Critchlow and his team continue to fight for regular working families of South Bend every single day. And they are getting results. Their work continues to go beyond just providing temporary emergency assistance to families in crisis, which is important for the stability of our community. They have taken on major issues like renters' rights, fighting for the residents of Cedar Glen apartment complex. They created a new fire territory to increase public safety. And Portage Township's Health and Eating Initiative, Nourish, is working to increase the health of low-income populations. Trustee Jason is even supporting local public education in a campaign to educate the community by bringing transparency to the local government processes. This year, in partnership with Real Services, Portage Township even opened the area's only permanent senior community center called the Portage Commons at Colfax and William Street in downtown South Bend. Learn more about these services and much, much more at portage-township.com. The link is in the show notes. A heartfelt thank you to Jason and your team for all that you do for our area. You mentioned the legendary Father Charles Stewart. Is that how you pronounce it? Stewart?
Stewart.
Many folks who have visited the West End area, you're kind of aware that there was drinking establishments, frequently throughout the neighborhood, and the beer was a big part of their culture. But the popular leader of the St. Bavo's Church, Father Charles Stewart, he was staunchly opposed to the drinking. And I got a kick out of seeing that in your presentation. Just talk to us about that.
Yeah, so Father Stewart, he was an extremely passionate priest. He was very, very passionate for his flock. And he tried to, in many, many ways, he came from a very educated family. He was 26 years old. He spoke 3 languages.
Wow.
By the way, the 3 languages were French, German, and Flemish. He didn't know English when he came to the United States.
Wow, okay.
So he picked it up pretty quickly. But he was very, very adamantly opposed to drinking. He believed it was sinful. It was it was dragging down the community. It would drag down an individual. So he crusaded. He started when he was still at St. Joseph Parish. He was crusading against drinking.
Okay.
He was. He put out a flyer, a circular about how it's going to ruin you and ruin your family. And then his sermons at St. Bavo. He would constantly talk about the evil of imbibing and the evils of drinking. And of course, yes, there's watering holes all over the West End. Now, interestingly, they weren't supposed to be there.
Okay.
They were supposed to be either downtown or someplace more centrally located.
Right.
And they certainly weren't supposed to be open on Sunday. But he would march down 6th Street and he would barge into these bars and he'd shame people.
That is wild.
And there was one occasion which he marched into a bar, started shaming everyone, and the bar owner said, "Hey, I bought 2 pews at St. Bavo, and you're in here yelling at me." Father Stewart took money out of his pocket, paid him back for the pews, and said, "I don't want that money. I don't want that money in St. Bavo." So, but not only was he going around and screaming and yelling at the individuals, but he went to the law. So he would
formally.
He would go to the police.
Yes.
He would testify in court cases against all of the drinking that was going on. And he used the South Bend Tribune as a mouthpiece.
Okay.
He would constantly talk about the horrors of drinking.
Yeah.
And these people are doing these terrible things in the West End, and I'm trying to clean it up. And here's why drinking is bad. And it upset the people that like to drink.
Of course, yeah.
So they got, they came over to the rectory and they threw bricks through the window. There was one night where they broke every single window in the rectory and there was, they were drunken.
Of course.
People that went out, they were destroying the place. But at any rate, it didn't stop him. He continued, and he also was on a really strong mission against Cam and Schellinger.
That's what I was going to say. And Cam and Schellinger is a huge name in Mishawaka, and the city of Mishawaka grew right along with the brewery, Schellinger.
Yes. So now, back in that particular era, if you wanted to buy beer, you didn't buy it at the grocery store or, there wasn't a shop for it.
Right.
They would sell it to the local watering holes. And so that's where people would get their booze. And so that was what was happening. Cam and Schellinger were selling it to the watering holes in the West End.
Yep.
And Father Stewart was angry about it. And he openly was accusing them of bringing the neighborhood to decline.
Yeah, contributing to that.
Yeah, contributing to the debauchery that was going on down there. And he went on to call them pseudo-philosophers and liquor autocrats.
That is wild.
Because he was so angry. And then they started complaining to the bishop. They're like, this guy is crazy.
Yeah.
He's yelling at us, and he's shaming us. He's taking us to court. But Father Stewart would not stop. And Kevin Schellinger met with him on several occasions.
Sure.
And at one point, they even told him, they said, these Belgians are beyond reproach. Don't worry about it. They're never going to quit drinking. Just, go about doing what you're doing, because they're never going to stop. So they were kind of talking here's the group that they're selling the booze to.
Of course. They had their own interests.
Right.
Of course.
Exactly. So wow. So he fought with the local community that were drinking. He fought with Cam and Schellinger. Yeah. But I will tell you, though, as much animosity was there. So the drunks didn't like him, of course. And Cam and Schellinger didn't like him. But pretty much every pastor and priest, business owner in Mishawaka were on his side, as were most of his parishioners. So as much as he was causing a ruckus and taking people to court and getting people really angry, for every one person that he was making angry, there were 20 that said, we love what you're doing. Right. Keep doing it. Keep fighting. Get the liquor out of our neighborhood. So he cared about his parish, and he wanted to make sure that they would not suffer because of all of the drinking that was going on. He just felt like it was a horrible thing.
And also, it was across the country was the temperance movement and around the time, and it led to the prohibition. So he wasn't alone probably in that.
There were a lot of people who thought that there was nothing good that would come from drinking.
Right. But then he abruptly resigned, and it's a mystery, huh?
Yeah, I mean, so
he was such a good leader in the community too, so they felt it when he left.
It was very, very mysterious, but I think we can put pieces of the puzzle together. Yeah. So this was 1912. He'd been there for 10 years working with the community, and he was pretty beloved.
Right.
I mean, he was fighting the liquor, but he was beloved in the community for business leaders, parishioners, and so forth.
Right.
All of a sudden, 1912, he comes to Mass, and he tells the congregation, I am being forced to resign.
Wow.
And there are no written documents that I know of that state exactly what he said.
Right.
But he said, I am being told I need to leave. And within 2 days, he was on a train. That's crazy. He went out west. Now, what we do know, because we don't know specifically what happened, what we do know is that there were other pastors in the city who said from their pulpits that, okay, you have 2,000 parishioners over at St. Bavo that are upset about this. We should have thousands of people from every congregation in this city that are upset about this, the fact that Father Stewart had to go. So all the churches were just up in arms about the fact that this priest who fought so hard against drinking and imbibing was gone. But interestingly, what happened on the day he resigned, or said he was being forced to resign, 200 parishioners from St. Bavo marched over to St. Joe Rectory.
Wow.
To bang on the door of Father Mensch and to complain about the fact that Father Stewart was being made to resign.
Wow.
Well, not only did he not open the door, he called the police.
Okay.
He was the one religious leader in the city of Mishawaka who was not coming to Father Stewart's defense.
I gotcha.
Now, who sat in St. Joe's pews? Cam and Schellinger.
See, look at that.
So, I mean, hey. I'm not going to say mystery solved.
Of course, but we can probably put the dots together, connect the dots.
They put a ton of money into St. Joe Parish, a ton of money. And they were angry.
I'm sure.
So,
you can connect the dots, most likely. Hey,
I know that's me being a history sleuth.
Of course,
I can't.
Of course.
That's listed factually where the diocese won't.
No,
respond
they won't.
to my inquiry. So
right, I'm sure.
I'm just gonna guess.
Around the same time in the early 1900s, pre World War I, it was a time of great growth in Mishawaka, and there were some big employers here. And so, what were some of the big employers of the Belgian community in Mishawaka?
Well, so the two biggest probably were Dodge Manufacturing, the pulley factory is what they called it, and the Mishawaka Woolen Factory, which was the predecessor for Ball Band. There were so many Belgians working at the Mishawaka Woolen Factory that they called it the Belgian Shoe College. Of course, they also had a lot of people that were employed in the businesses up and down 7th and West that there were Belgian-speaking businesses that were there.
Right.
Dodge actually gave money for the brick edifice of St. Bavo to be built. So they kind of
invested in their employees in that sense.
Very much so. And Melville Mix, who was the president of Dodge, he was very, very generous with the Belgians, particularly during the war years and so forth. He opened up a shop right there within Dodge where people get things like grocery items at cost.
Oh, cool.
So he was very, very generous.
Charitable.
And with his employees.
Oh, that's nice. And I don't know if you see that as much anymore with employers, but that was a different time, different era.
Well, it was a different time, but I do want to point out. So yes, that was nice. But during that era, we didn't have the same laws.
No.
There was no OSHA or anything like that. So these people worked really long hours in very dirty, awful conditions, and it was dangerous. Once a week, you would read in the newspaper about an injury or a death. People would hurt themselves, and when they did, there was no recourse. If you lost a limb at one of these factories, that was it.
You didn't have sick days even, probably.
Right, and what do you do for work afterwards? You have to rely on charity moving forward.
Yeah,
so
that's true.
These Belgians slaved away in these workplaces, and yes, Melville Mix was compassionate,
of course,
but it was just we didn't have the same safety nets that we do today.
Right. In your presentation, you also talked about some of the leisure activities that the Belgian community participated in. Let's talk about a few of those.
Well, number one is pigeon racing.
Okay.
Of course. Pigeon racing was the biggest thing, and that was carried over from Belgium. A lot of the people that moved to Mishawaka, they'd raced pigeons back home, but that actually the Pigeon Club started as early as the 1890s. Okay. And so they were racing, and they raced them all over the United States.
Yeah.
Some of them they would send down as far as New Orleans.
That is crazy.
The pigeons would fly back to Mishawaka from New Orleans.
Fly back to the West End.
Yeah. So, and they were very competitive about it. There were a lot of pigeon coops everywhere, all over the West End, and really that went on to the 1990s. So it went on for 100 years. That's a number one thing. Another really big activity, of course, was bicycling.
Okay.
That was also carried over from the home country. Although they were probably not doing it there. That was probably something they were doing here and not there.
Okay.
But the little clubs, they would have uniforms with matching sweaters and caps, and they'd race up and down 6th and 7th Street. Sometimes they'd go down the Bremen Highway for a longer ride, but or they would do loops all the way around Mishawaka. But there was a lot of bicycling. And of course, there's also they had bowling and they had archery, and they had clubs for all this. They were also known for gardening, and by the way, they're also, and this would come into play a little bit later, right? But they had a football team.
Okay,
so they played football against Mishawaka High School, which is weird. Like now you think, of course, it's not something that we would think of as being normal today. But they had a different football club. Yep.
And I think it was later on, but I'm not sure. We're still talking pre-World War I, but you did write about a velodrome. I've never even heard of what that is.
Yeah, so...
on 14th and West Street?
Yeah. So there was... so a velodrome is a bicycle track, but it's a bicycle track that is on a slanted angle. So when you're riding on the bicycle track, you're riding...
Kind of slanted a little bit, tilted.
Yeah. So, there was one that was built in the early 1920s that was in another part of the West End. But the most magnificent one, was at 14th and West. It was... They called it the Mishawaka Oval. It was finished around 1928.
Okay.
And it was, by the way, the fifth velodrome in the United States.
That's nuts.
So there were only 4 other velodromes. There were 2 in New York, 1 in Chicago, 1 in Detroit.
And then one in Mishawaka.
And 1 in Mishawaka, Indiana. So people literally came from all over the world to race at the Mishawaka Velodrome.
I've never heard of it.
Some people call it the Mishawaka Oval. Some people called it the Saucer.
Okay.
But at any rate, it only lasted for a few years.
Okay.
And it was used for other things too. I think they had some boxing matches there, and then they ice skated, I think, in the final year.
Okay.
It really only lasted to about 1931.
Okay.
So, and then it was dismantled. Yeah. But they didn't realize what was going to happen with all the freezing and the thawing with the snow and so forth.
I got you.
But yeah, it was
there's still... Now, I'm not going to go out now with the snow on the ground, but I will head there once the snow melts. There's still a remnants of the incline of it?
Yeah, so not the incline of it necessarily, but when they dug out the earth to put the velodrome in, they had to dig out quite a bit. And they just left a pile of dirt there. But if you go by the corner of 14th and West, you'll notice that a house is sitting on a hill. And when I say a hill, it doesn't look like it's a natural hill.
It's not natural.
It looks like it's something that has been fabricated. So that is dirt that was dug up, left over from that velodrome.
That's cool. I've never heard of it. I just love stuff like that. I just love how our cities evolve and how things used to be there, and there's still remnants of some things still. And I don't know. I just love that kind of stuff.
And there are still velodromes around the United States today. They're still in existence. But of course, none in Mishawaka anymore.
Yeah. Makes me think of the Little Five down in Bloomington.
Oh, yeah.
More of the interview in a moment, but first, a word from another one of our sponsors. I want to thank MT Box Computers for helping to support our podcast and our content. Located at 2921 Mishawaka Avenue in South Bend, right in the heart of River Park, MT Box Computers can help your business reduce its cost and increase its productivity. MT Box Computers is a full-service computer and network solution company. Their technicians are certified by industry-leading standards. They work with small and medium-sized businesses in the Michiana area to provide computer-related support, as they not only understand technology, but they also understand the day-to-day needs of small businesses. They strive to find the best solution for your business. Through experience, they have found that most companies have different needs, and those needs require different solutions. They'd love the opportunity to evaluate your business's current technology environment and discuss ways that they can increase your productivity and save you money. Check out their website at mtboxcomputers.com to learn more. A link to their website is in the show notes. And now, back to the episode. We'll get to World War I here in a sec. And you had, in your presentation, you mentioned that the area before World War I wasn't quite as kept up with neat, clean lawns and everything like that. Is that right? Like you mentioned, even like dirt streets, some infectious diseases and stuff that were probably reminiscent or probably similar to other neighborhoods at the time too.
Yeah. So during that particular period of time, I mean, this is a different era. Yes, the streets were all dirt. Disease was pretty rampant, and anytime
livestock you wrote about.
Yes, as a matter of fact, they had livestock on the property. Water would pool in front of the homes on the streets, and rats would drown in the pools, and so you had a lot of animals, a lot of livestock, a lot of disease, and there wasn't they didn't have the infrastructure. So we were talking about outhouses, and so there were just dangers that were associated with being close to those types of waste or that type of waste.
Right.
And and it was uncomfortable. And anytime anything would happen, everybody would blame the Belgians. Those Belgians, they brought those diseases.
Right.
They didn't check them closely enough at Ellis Island. There was a lot of disdain directed toward the West End. I mean, it's not like when you think of it today with neat and tidy lawns and everything manicured.
Yeah.
It was
different.
It was rough.
Yeah.
It was a completely different environment from what it is today.
Right.
So people had to contend with those diseases. And so it was very unattractive, and it's someplace that wouldn't be as appealing like it is now.
Yeah, right. Speaking of World War I, that was obviously, it affected the Belgian immigrants or the Belgian neighbors greatly because of Belgium's involvement in the war. Let's just talk about that, and it led to a scene outside of St. Bavo's at the end of World War I.
Well, yeah. So when you think about World War I, so that started in Europe in 1914, in July of 1914. And the United States didn't get involved till 1917. So while people in the United States were, upset about it, it didn't necessarily directly impact them.
Right.
For the Belgians, a lot of them had just moved here. So the war kicks off in 1914. Within a few weeks, Germany is invading Belgium.
Yeah.
And they're going to occupy. And they ravaged the land. So they were blowing things up. They were rounding up civilians and killing them. So the Belgians who had just come here,
absolutely,
they're thinking, these were my communities and my land and my friends and my family. And they were beside themselves with this idea that their land was being ravaged. It wasn't being... So their impressions started in 1914, where they started becoming heavily impacted. And interestingly, by the way, there were quite a few people living in Mishawaka who were not actually American citizens yet. They were still Belgian citizens.
Yeah.
So
added to the fear and...
Well, it added to the fear, but Belgium called them up. So they had to go fight for Belgium. So you had people living in the West End in 1914, 15, 16, whose sons were fighting in Europe for Belgium.
Yes.
Because they were still technically Belgian citizens.
That's wild.
So it impacted them on an entirely different level. Yes. And even when the United States got involved in 1917, so yes, then other men were sent over there from the United States, but still the war was not being fought on our land.
Of course, yeah.
It was being fought on their homeland.
Right.
So this is and they, of course, we lost young Belgian men. A lot of young Belgian men were injured. So it was a very somber time, and everyone was very, very stressed out with what was going on.
Of
course.
And
this lasted for 4 years. So their trauma started really in 1914. And they went through these horrible, horrible 4 years of just worry and stress and devastation over the idea that their homeland was being ravaged.
Right.
So the day that the war ends, and we were on November 11th, 1918.
Okay.
When armistice was signed, it was very early in the morning here, like 2 o'clock in the morning. And back then, to get word across...
you don't get on your iPhone then.
Yeah, right. You don't get on your iPhone. And you're really not picking up the telephone either. The West End, the easiest way to spread information was to tell people.
Okay.
So people were running door to door and banging on people's doors. The war is over. The war is over. And people were ecstatic. It was 2 o'clock in the morning. They come pouring out of their homes. A lot of them still in their bedclothes.
Of course.
It's November. They're bringing pots and pans out, and they're banging pots and pans together. Every church bell in the city was pealing.
That's cool.
Every whistle on every factory was blowing.
That's cool.
The whistle on Cam and Schellinger, it was a whistle that started in a low tone and went up way high, and they kept doing it over and over again. People said it sent a tingle down their spines.
Yeah.
People came out in the street. People were grabbing their musical instruments, walking around, banging on everything and playing instruments, and it was sheer bedlam. People were just ecstatic. And it led up to a big parade at 10 o'clock in the morning, and people partied all day.
Right.
But the culmination of all of this was that evening, the mayor came down to the corner of 7th and West to thank the Belgians for all their contributions.
Absolutely.
It was not lost on him,
right.
the suffering that was there.
Yep.
And there were speeches by all kinds of dignitaries, and bands were playing, and some of the Italians were there too. When everything was came to a head at 8:00 when they burnt the Kaiser in effigy at the foot of St. Bavo's to cheers of 2,000 people.
That's a lot of people.
It's a lot of people. People were happy.
Yes.
And they had been mourning for 4 years. 4 years.
Absolutely.
It was a somber time. And here, for them, this to them was sheer joy.
Yeah.
Because now our boys are coming home and our country can go back to what it was, or at least try to.
Right. And you don't think about a little Mishawaka, Indiana, and the impact that a war over there can have, and they're going to fight for Belgium, I mean, and they're already over here in America. That's nuts. And then again, it was they couldn't turn the TV on and see that news. They couldn't get on the internet or anything. And so that either makes you worry more, or that's tough. That's tough. After World War I, the West End continued to grow, though, right? I mean, businesses continued to pop up, and
it absolutely did. So the West End continued to grow. People still were coming in. The Flemish weren't coming in still in droves, because we still had there were still immigration restrictions. But people were having children, and businesses were thriving, and this was almost like a heyday for that particular neighborhood, because it really had reached its pinnacle at that point. There were storefronts filled up and down every street with Belgian businesses, Belgian social clubs, Flemish being spoke on the streets. You could almost say that this little community, it was self-contained. You could do everything there. You could, you get your dry cleaning, you could go grocery shopping, you could buy some flowers, you could you could do anything and everything. You could bank. Anything and everything that you wanted to do, you could do right there in the West End in Flemish. And that's neat. And that's coming out of World War I. So it was a very, very exciting time.
And there's a building where I've walked around there that I've always been intrigued by. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, but Achille Alley. Anyway, up on top there, it says Achille Alley. So ACHILLE and then ALLY, maybe ally. Anyways, so that building's still there. And I looked it up online on newspapers.com, because you can go down rabbit holes on newspaper.com. And so I found a really neat article from 1930. And it turns out that was a business building by a gentleman named Achille Alley, or however you pronounce it. And I found out that it was a department store originally. But I also found an article from 1930 that I think exemplifies some of the Belgian culture at that time. The headline was, "A riot? No, just an old Belgian custom." It was a birthday party for Achille's 80-year-old mother-in-law that Mishawaka police thought was a riot. They received several calls about it, and a crowd of 300 people were celebrating on the intersection of 7th and West Street, a brass band and all. And then the officer demanded to know what was the cause of all this. And the mother-in-law stepped up and she said, "I am. It's my party and I'm the queen. I'm 80 years old today." And the police learned that was a custom, and on 80th birthdays, they just come out and celebrate. So they said, "Keep celebrating, but go to a side street."
You are absolutely right. I have heard this story. This is the story of what was going on during that particular era. That is how people communicated, what they did for fun. There weren't televisions. There weren't these other entertainment sources, particularly in a city the size of Mishawaka. What did people do for fun? They got together. They got together and they hung out. It was all about being with other people. And these types of things were very, very common, and people got excited. People really, really did, because it was their fun time.
Hey, and again, all this history right under our noses, and I'm just always curious, and all I did was I just searched the address of that building, and boom, they let me know what the original intent of the building was. It went into his mother-in-law, and I think it's actually a residence today. Like, I think somebody lives in there, you know?
With a lot of different antiques and things. It's chock full of
that's cool.
All kinds of interesting things.
It's so neat. And again, I don't know. I just love neighborhoods like that with the storefronts mixed in with residential, and it shows what it was like back in that era. In your presentation, it's probably post World War I, you talked about the Ku Klux Klan. And I learned from reading the book that Todd Tucker wrote that around that time, the Ku Klux Klan was not just against, like African Americans per se. It was also ethnic groups. And so they had a negative impact on the Catholic Belgian community as well.
So, yes. So not just Black people, but Catholics and Jews as well. And ethnic Catholics were really, really a target for the Klan during that particular era. And that, of course, being the 1920s, which was the resurrection of the Klan from the post-Reconstruction period. But they decided that they were going to antagonize the Belgians of Mishawaka. And so they started burning crosses in the hills, right at the base, of the West End.
Okay.
So the people from the West End could clearly see these crosses. They were big. They were making them with the types of material that telephone poles are made out of. So these were big crosses.
Wow. Okay.
So you definitely could see them burning.
Right.
And, and the Belgians were scared to death. Because they knew it was targeting them. So Indiana had a huge connection with the Ku Klux Klan, unfortunately. They believe that at one point in time, as many as 30% of Hoosiers were in some way connected to the Klan. And that included the people that lived around Mishawaka and South Bend. The Klan really, they supported prohibition. They opposed labor unions. They opposed immigration, and they opposed any type of foreign engagement. But they really hated those Catholics. And they also operated as vigilantes. Sometimes they would come in people's homes, and they would say, you're making booze here or whatever you're doing, and they would drag people out, and in the name of the law. And they were, like I said, they were burning crosses. And one of the biggest events that they had was Christmas Eve of 1922.
Okay.
They were burning a cross in the Mishawaka Hills over Belgian Town, and it burned for an hour. And they had several hundred people that showed up for also an induction that night. So they kept having these Klan rallies in the hills. They were passing out literature in downtown Mishawaka.
Right.
This did go on for several years, eventually died out. But the Klan was very involved in politics, and they tried to sway votes. And, the priest the pastor at St. Bavo, he was very clear with his parishioners on how to vote.
Okay.
Because he understood what the connection was between the Klan and the politics.
Yeah.
The Klan also would run around Belgian Town leaving
pamphlets, probably, or
paper.
And
they would leave threatening notes on people's front stoops.
That's scary, man.
It's very scary. And at one point, they got baskets with little notes attached to them, like they were a gift. And the note in the basket said, "Better days are coming. The Ku Klux Klan." And so this scared people.
Absolutely.
But a lot of people don't realize that there were crosses burning in the Mishawaka Hills.
Right. That's scary. Also around, a little past that era, but pre-World War II, in 1930, a legendary West End building was built, the BK Club. Is that right?
That is right. The BK Club came into existence. Well, actually, as a club, it came into existence several years before 1930. Mishawakans in 1925, they started participating in the Volksring in South Bend. So they also had a Belgian club in South Bend. It was right next to their Belgian Catholic church. So Mishawaka was inspired. They said, we're going to open up one too, and called it the Broederenkring, which means the Brothers Circle.
Okay.
So it evolved into the word BK.
I got you.
Because Broederenkring was a mouthful, but BK was not really used in common nomenclature until the 1960s. But at any rate, they established their own club to help people in distress and to get their citizenship, and it's for mutual cooperation and so forth. And there were two earlier Belgian clubs in Mishawaka, but this was the one that really, really stayed, obviously. So it's been around for almost 100 years. The Pigeon Club kind of overlapped. So there were a lot of people that were already in the Pigeon Club that also became part of the BK Club. And that building that was constructed, it was about $20,000. And they opened with a parade celebration over July 4th. Thousands of people were there, including Prince Albert, the envoy to Belgium. And the massive celebration lasted the entire weekend.
That's neat.
So at that point, when that building was constructed, and there's all kinds of clubs and activities that were in there. So St. Bavo was the spiritual home. And at that point, BK became the social home.
Okay.
So that was where really one was fulfilling their sacred needs and one was fulfilling their emotional needs.
That makes sense.
From a social perspective.
Yeah, that makes sense. And again, I've been in there for varied receptions and parties and graduation parties and everything like that. It's a neat old building. It's cool. After World War II, like other ethnic areas in the country, the West End, Belgian concentration kind of began to dissipate.
Yeah. So, and it was just this natural thing that happens over time.
Right.
People started moving out. They didn't stay. One of the things that happened was kids, they were going to school. They would go to St. Bavo, but then they'd go to the local high school.
Yeah.
In the earlier years, people didn't always go to high school. They did, as time went on, after the World War II, that people were going to high school. And guess what? They were meeting other kids who were not Belgian.
Yep.
And God forbid, not even Catholic sometimes, So here they were meeting other people. More people had access to cars. They could drive other places. So they started meeting and marrying other people and moving out. And we didn't have the Flemish people coming in, so that the language started kind of falling apart too. Some people still spoke it, of course, down at the BK Club or whatever, but it wasn't like you'd walk down the street and hear Flemish all the time anymore, like you had at one time. And plus, as far as shopping was concerned, things were going to change there too. So you had Town and Country Shopping Center opening up, and so people were going elsewhere to shop.
Right.
The West End Bank, which was Flemish speaking and catering to the Flemish, that became Valley Bank, and that changed everything too. So businesses started moving out, and the landscape just slowly started changing. So you didn't see it happening overnight, but piecemeal. And the last Belgian grocery closed in the early 1970s.
Okay.
And I think the last Belgian business to pull out that was run by Belgians was probably De Kloot's, which is the florist. And I think that was the mid-teens, somewhere about 10 years ago. But,
okay.
But it took a long time, but it slowly started happening. The Belgian town of the West End of the 1950s, 60s, 70s was not that of the 20s, 30s, 40s.
Yeah.
It just started, and this happens everywhere, all over America.
Absolutely. People
assimilate and become, I mean, they were Americans anyway, but they become part of the American culture.
Right. Just to kind of wrap it up, there's still numerous reminders of the Belgian West End around today. Just talk to us about some of those reminders if you take a stroll through there and what folks would see if they did that.
So if you walk through there today, you will still see some remnants of things from the past. You will see some of the names etched in the parapets that are Belgian names, the names that begin with VAN or DE.
Yes.
And you will still see names of businesses and some of the mosaics on the entryways. You will still see that. And of course, you're still going to see the business district itself, which a lot of it is not touched. You will see the BK Club, which is such an important institution. And the grand edifice that is St. Bavo. And I did want to say about St. Bavo that we didn't talk about earlier because they'd gotten permission to build this brick building in 1903. It was dedicated in 1905. Early January 1st of 1905. And this was truly a moment for them. And when you look at the three historic churches in downtown Mishawaka, St. Joe, St. Monica, and St. Bavo, you will note that a lot of people will say that they will walk into St. Joe or St. Monica and think that it's something that is that's so magnificent. They're both very architecturally significant, and they have kind of this glorious exterior and interior that's unmatchable.
Right.
And St. Bavo sits on this humble side street. But that doesn't make it any less significant. It is so important to the fabric of Mishawaka. The people that went to church there, they worked in the factories. They were the ones responsible for the fact that we had mansions along Lincoln Way. They worked their fingers to the bone. They were the backbone of Mishawaka, building that church from the ground up. And what I finally have to say about that is that those people left a legacy for us, and it's for us to preserve and protect that moving forward because it belongs to all of us.
Yeah, I love it. Well, hey, Susanna, I appreciate you coming on here. I appreciate all of this knowledge. I appreciate all the work that you put into amassing this knowledge. Again, if folks like you or me or Pete DeKeever or whoever stop caring about this stuff, then it'll just be lost to the wayside. And so we don't know where we're going unless we know where we're coming from. So thank you.
That's right. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Thank you once again for listening to another episode of Round the Bend Now and Then. An extra special thanks to Susanna for coming on our show and sharing your knowledge and research about one of our community's most unique historic neighborhoods, Mishawaka's West End. Please be sure to follow us on all of our social media. The links are in the show notes. Also, please be sure to share the show with somebody that you think would appreciate it. Join us again next time to learn more about South Bend and Mishawaka's Now and Then.